say about this kind of determining what is our future.
Yeah.
In Revelation, and whatever we say and discuss here, of course, can be incorporated into what we discuss next Tuesday. So I'm not saying, well, let's talk about it now and talk about something different.
And then don't tell anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, don't tell anybody. It's our secret.
It's a big secret. Yeah.
And it's not like we discuss it once and I'll remember it forever anyway.
Well, I understand what Don's saying, because I'm kind of in his predicament too. I mean, I think Revelation, most of it is talking about Israel and what's happened already to them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think after Christ comes, which he hasn't yet, of course, and what Revelation's talking about after when Christ comes, it's got to kind of be our future too. Right? Is that wrong?
Yeah. So no, it's not wrong.
Okay.
So the question, Don, I think can be restated as this. Tell me if this is right. What parts of the Revelation are in our future?
Yeah.
And so different groups have answered it differently. Yes, from a preterist perspective, I think that's what you asked earlier. Where would a preterist see the break from first century fulfillment to in our future fulfillment? So I can go through that pretty easy and quickly, and then I can go through the other views also. So preterists believe that the book of Revelation, that the main subjects of the book of Revelation are the judgment of God's first century enemies. And by God's first century enemies, they mean Jerusalem or Israel that was persecuting the church. And then some preterists, maybe most preterists, would also include Rome. So the first century enemies, there's either one, which is Jerusalem, or two, which is Jerusalem and Rome. And we can see that those are the first century enemies just by looking at the book of Acts. And, if we know additional history. Yeah.
I think a lot of people kind of gloss over or overlook the fact that in Revelation, and most of Revelation, it's talking about Israel's persecution of Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We say, well, the thing in Revelation, it's about the fall of Israel. It's about the fall of Jerusalem.
Right. And the destruction of the temple coming
at the hands of the Romans, but it's also about the persecution of the Christian faith by both of those groups.
Right. And I think the martyr theme actually shows that it's the persecution from both groups. But some preterists think that it's Jerusalem's the enemy all throughout the Revelation. And some preterists think it's Jerusalem up through chapter 11. So the layout of the book would be this. Chapter 1 is the introduction, but Jesus introduces himself. John sees a vision of Jesus walking among the candlestands, holding the stars in his hands. That signifies that the Lord is among his people always, and he's got them in his hands. He's taking care of them. And then the message of the Lord to 7 churches that existed in the first century, that's chapters 2 and 3. And the purpose of those messages is not only to point out things that they need to do better and things that they need to repent of, and not only to commend them for doing well, so it's kind of an inspection or a pre-inspection evaluation, but also to prepare them for things to come. Things are going to be difficult, and so he warns them about that, tells them about that, and calls them to be faithful, calls them to have endurance. And then in chapter 4 and 5, we have visions of God on the throne and the Lamb coming into the courtroom and receiving the 7-sealed scroll and the worship of all of heaven. And he's worthy to do that because of his finished work of redemption, which he has just finished. He walks into the courtroom as a lamb that's been slain. He's all bloody and cut up, and he walks into the courtroom.
Is this Christ?
This would be Christ.
Yeah.
And he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he receives authority to execute judgment. And that's what, the the scrolls. This is what it says in Daniel, right? And this is what Jesus says in, I think it's Matthew 16. He says, I'm going to receive authority to execute judgment because I am the Son of Man. He says the Father judges no one. He's given all judgment into the hands of the Son. And then we have a picture of that in Revelation 5. And then Revelation 6 through 10 basically would be the opening of the seals. Well, 6 through 8 is the opening of the seals, and then after that you have the trumpets. So 6 through 8, beginning of 8 is the seals, and then 8 through 10 is the trumpets. And these are all coming from the hand of the Lord who opens the seals. And the trumpets come out of the last seal. And those are all announcements of and pictures of coming judgment upon those people who have persecuted Christ's people and who have disobeyed and denied continually the word of God and the commandments of the Lord. And the enemy that is being judged, you see the fall of that enemy. It's pictured as a city in chapter 11. And in chapter 11, it is identified as the city of Jerusalem, verse 8, 11:8. Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified, in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem falls in chapter 11. Chapter 12 is a transitional chapter. Chapter 12 moves the I'm trying to get
I'm happy
my
to see you're
book
still
of Revelation.
recording.
Yeah. So
Yeah, so we can go back and see this.
yeah, I'll send you a handout about it too. Chapter 12 is transitional, like I said. It takes the action from the so what happens is the city falls in chapter 11. That's Jerusalem. It falls. And then there's rejoicing in heaven over that. That's the seventh trumpet. And then chapter 12 moves the attention of the reader from Jerusalem, which has just fallen, to Rome. And how it does that is that it talks about Israel, the woman clothed with the sun, who brings forth the man child who the dragon wants to consume. And this is Jesus. This is Israel, the Old Testament. Israel brings forth the Messiah. The dragon wants to kill Jesus. God protects him. The dragon, thinks he's successful because he takes down a third of the stars out of heaven, a pictorial thing about
The angels.
Yeah, it's either, it's rulers of some sort. And that, but actually God protects the child, takes him up into heaven. And so then the dragon goes to make war against the children of the woman, the other children of the woman. And this would be then the disciples of Jesus, the brothers of Jesus in the faith, right? And and so it says that the dragon in verse 17 of chapter 12 became furious with the woman, went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. The sea there is probably the Mediterranean Sea. That would be the sea that Jerusalem was at. And if you look across the sea, what you see is Rome. And so what we have is a picture here of a dragon who's just come up out of the sea and is standing on the seashore at Jerusalem. It's Rome. And actually the dragon is the devil, but he's going to call forth another, a couple of beasts. And these beasts are described in ways that make me think that they're Rome. And many people think they're Rome. So Rome, the second great enemy, is talked about then from chapter 13 through the fall of Babylon, 18, through the marriage supper of the Lamb, 19. And then we have the rider on the white horse. And that's Revelation 19:11. And many people see there the second coming of Christ. Preterists don't generally see the second coming of Christ right there. What they see is Christ riding forth basically through history. So it's a picture of what's actually happening. The judgment of the enemies of God is precipitated by Christ riding through history with the sword coming out of his mouth and the gospel going forth. And this ends, actually, the end of the story is that all of God's enemies are subdued by the gospel, which is what chapter 19 seems to be about. Following that, following that picture of the gospel going out, you have the 1,000 years, Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20 is another transitional chapter. It's going to move. So what you've had so far is, in the main content of the book, the main sections, you've had the judgment against Jerusalem announced and executed. And that goes chapters 6 through 11. 12 is a transitional chapter, moves the attention to Rome. Rome in league with Israel, and actually on Israel's soil. That's the point of the dragon being on the shore of the sea. He's right there in the land. Is the second enemy, and they're the subject of, Rome is the subject of chapters 13 through 18, where they fall. Then there's rejoicing in heaven. Then we have a picture of the rider on the white horse, which may or may not be the second coming, but I don't think it is. And that when we get there eventually, we can talk about it. But I think it's a picture of Christ riding through history, basically, with the gospel. And so we have two pictures then of a long period of time. We've got this riding through history with the gospel, and we've got chapter 20, which is the 1,000 years. So chapter 20 then becomes another transitional chapter, moving it in time, moving the action in time from the fall of the second enemy to the final judgment.
Does that be the fall of Rome?
Yeah, so the fall of Rome to the final judgment. And the final judgment is depicted in, verse 11 of chapter 20. You get the final judgment. And then after that, you get the new heavens and the new earth. So you have the consummation of all the promises of God, the new heavens and new earth, new Jerusalem, heaven and hell, all of that right there. And so on a preterist reading, Don, what part is in our future? The part that is in our future is the return of the Lord, the physical return of the Lord, the physical resurrection, the judgment of the living and of all people, the wicked and the righteous, the eternal state, heaven or hell, the new heavens and new earth, and the new Jerusalem, and living with God, God's people living with God forever. That's what's in our future, because preterism would see everything all the way through chapter 19 to have, except for the rider on the white horse, to have already been accomplished. Futurism, so historic premillennialists and dispensationalists, they're futurist system, and they have two different places in the Revelation where they might see it as being in our future. So a dispensationalist would see, their outline would be at chapter 4. Chapter 4, most dispensationalists would see the rapture. And because it starts with, after this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven.
Mhm.
And the first voice, which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must soon take place," or what must take place after this. Dispensationalist teaching is that this is the majority view in dispensationalism, is that what's happening here is that John is being used as a stand-in for the whole church, and that when he's being called up to heaven, it's a picture of the rapture. I wonder about that interpretation. I'm not the only one that wonders about that interpretation. But on the specific point of the dispensationalist insistence on literalism, and that there aren't really any symbols unless it says the word like or as. So they'll say something is a symbol. I saw him, he was like a lamb that was slain. They'll say that's a symbol. There's nothing in here that says that John is representing the church. And there's nothing in the Revelation that says that John is representing the church. And there's nothing in the whole Bible that says that John is representing the church. So I don't know where they get that idea that he's representing the church, but on their views, I don't know where they get that idea. But that's where they would say.
Dispensationalists, I'll just jump ahead. Do they think that any of Revelation is about the fall of Jerusalem?
No, not the past fall of Jerusalem.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they believe that
didn't know
it's
that either.
Yeah, they believe that it is exclusively from chapter 4 on. So on the dispensational scheme, you have the purpose of the rapture. The dispensational rapture is that Jesus comes down from heaven and then kind of does a U-turn, and with his people, the dead in Christ rise and they go with him, and those who are
Scoops them up.
kind of scoops them up, snatches them up, catches them up, and takes them back to heaven. That's the dispensational rapture. And the reason that the function of the dispensational rapture in the dispensational system is that it removes the church from the earth.
Mhm.
And that's important because on dispensational teaching, God has two peoples, Israel and the church, and he only deals with one at a time. And after Israel rejected the Messiah, God stopped dealing with them, and now he's dealing with the church.
Chuck, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If we don't feel that Revelation is about the future, so then the only talking about Christ's return, where that's discussed in Matthew and things like that,
Right.
that Revelation isn't about that.
Well,
Eventually,
yeah, eventually Christ returns in
Yeah.
Revelation,
Yeah.
in Revelation.
but on preterist principles, the Revelation is about things that happened in the first century, is relevant to actual events for the first century that the first century audience was being prepared for. And so, I've outlined the preterist view. The futurist view is chapter 4. One of the views is chapter 4 is the rapture. Dispensational view is that this removes the church from the earth so that
Mhm.
God can then deal with Israel again. And the first thing that he does is he pours out his wrath on Israel because they rejected the Messiah. And that's the tribulation. And the Great Tribulation, so there's different views of when the rapture happens on dispensationalism's timeline. But the Great Tribulation is the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. It's really, really bad. And then after that, and so the book of Revelation is from chapter 4 through 18 is about the Great Tribulation. Chapter 19 is
Our
about
future.
our future. Well, not
Yeah,
us.
okay.
The church won't be here on dispensational view, but it
Oh,
is in the
right.
future from where
Been
we are right
gone.
now. Right. So not our future, which is why you have some dispensational teachers saying it doesn't matter to me what this is about because I'm not going to be here. So
I've heard that many times.
yeah.
And the other thing that we have to we have to remember is that part of the reason for these different views is in part based on different views of when Revelation was written.
Right. I'm not sure what arises first. I think probably that's the secondary consideration, but it is certainly important. If Revelation is written before the fall of Jerusalem, then it's more logical that it's about the fall of Jerusalem. But
the dispensationalists,
yeah, the dispensationalists,
the purpose, they have to presuppose that it was written after the fall of Jerusalem.
right. And actually the thought process on the dispensationalist view is this. Since literalism is the way to interpret the Bible, then using literalism to interpret the Bible, you come out with a schema of two peoples of gods and two gospels and all that. And so you have to, the outline of the Revelation would be what I said. Chapter 4, the church is removed, tribulation follows. Then chapter 19, Jesus returns, and then there's the 1,000-year millennium on earth and all of that. All of that is a product of the system, of the interpretive system. Just like saying this is about the fall of Jerusalem is part of the interpretive system. The consideration of the date for dispensationalists is not critical. They don't start with the date and then say, since it was written late, what could it be about? They don't start there. The date becomes a later consideration, and I've even seen it argued this way by some dispensationalists. Since we know that this is about our future, it must have been written after the fall of Jerusalem. And most people say it was written then in 95 AD. So most dispensationalists don't say it like that, but I think that's the thought process. And of course, if you believe that your interpretation is absolutely certain, then the date question is a foregone conclusion. So
It'd be more accurate for me to say that preterist view, in that view, it had to have been written before.
yeah, it's absolutely certain. It's absolutely true that if the book of Revelation were proven to have been written after the fall of Jerusalem, then the preterist position would have to be significantly modified or would be completely destroyed. Right. So that is the that's the Achilles heel of preterism. But again, you pick the one that has the least problems, and I think that problem is not as bad as some of the problems in the other systems from my point of view. So the other futurist system, historic premillennialism, they don't see the rapture in chapter 4. They see, and because historic premillennialism, like all the other groups in church history, except for dispensationalism, all the other groups see the rapture as not Jesus taking his saints off the earth back to heaven, but as part of the second coming, when Jesus is returning, his saints rise to meet him, both the living and the dead, and then they get behind him in like a victory procession. They follow him down to earth, and that's the second coming. And so historic premillennialism sees the second coming at chapter 19. And so what's in our future, according to historic premillennialism, is the second coming, the 1,000 years, the resurrection, the judgment, heaven and hell, all the things that were pretty much in this. And so then, so how do idealists, what do idealists do? Idealists think that the book of Revelation is embodying principles and that are operative throughout the entirety of history. And so God's people are always persecuted. God always sustains them. God will judge. And these are the principles that we see in the parts of Revelation we read today. Chapter 19, Jesus returns. Chapter 20, idealists, most of them would reject a literal 1,000 years. They would say that's symbolic because everything on their interpretive principles, everything is expressing an idea, not unless it's a final consummation thing. And a final consummation thing would be return of Christ, raising of the dead, judgment, those things. Who do we have left? Yeah, that's pretty much everybody. So what you have then, most people, I think, when they interpret the Revelation and they say, or when they maybe not interpret it, but maybe when they're looking at the news and they're thinking about what is this in relationship to the Bible and where are we on some timeline they might have in their head. Most people are thinking in a dispensational or a idealist kind of mode when they look at the Revelation and they say, oh, this is happening today. Now, I would say it like this as a preterist. I would say these pictures of persecution in the Revelation and the pictures of God's judgment, that these were the actual reference was first century Christians and first century enemies of God, but that these are completely relevant to what's happening. I'm not looking at a timeline when I read the Revelation. What I'm looking at, so everybody becomes an idealist when they apply a passage, right? We always take a passage from its historical setting, get a principle from it, and say that's happening today or it applies to us today. We're all idealists.
And that's very possibly true.
Yeah, it's very possibly true.
Some of this it applies to the first century.
Yeah.
And it's continuously through today.
Yeah, I think as a general rule, the basic principle of the idealist interpretive system is sound. Their basic principle is this. In the Bible, God reveals himself as he deals with us. That's one of the things God reveals, not the totality, but that when we see God dealing with humans, what we see God reveal is patterns. He shows us in his examples of this is how I dealt with Noah, this is how I deal with Abraham, this is how I deal with David, etc. This is how I deal with the nation Israel. But what we see are patterns that keep being repeated in how God deals. And how does the world respond to the church? Well, we see the patterns. They're always the same. It's always the same pattern. And so we can look at the revelation and we could say, I see the patterns, and those patterns are applicable today. And
Mhm.
and so that's the way they would interpret the revelation. They wouldn't ever say, this beast from the sea, that exclusively is Nero, or that exclusively is Hitler, or that exclusively is the papacy. But what they will say is that Nero was the beast in his generation.
Mm.
Hitler was the beast
In his
in his
generation.
generation,
Yeah.
right? So they see recurring patterns, right? And when people preach through the revelation, they typically do that. They typically take an idealist approach. You know, unless you're dispensationalist and you have a chart and with a timeline. And when we've gone through the revelation, my concern hasn't been to actually apply the revelation. I'm hoping the Holy Spirit is doing that as we read through it, but to give examples of how you might want to interpret the revelation. You know, talk about how to, you know, how would we approach this passage? What would we look at to understand it? And so that's what I've been doing.
What do you believe, Chuck?
I think I'm a preterist.
You're a preterist, okay?
Yeah, I think this is about the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of
Yeah.
Rome in the first century, but I also think that there are patterns, and that
Yeah,
the reason I know
definitely.
God will certainly judge evil is because I see him certainly judging evil.
Mhm.
You know? So,
And the patterns, like you said, that's an interesting concept. I never
Yeah.
thought of that.
yeah. So all of God's revelation is based on patterns. I mean, that's what typology is. You know, Jesus
That's
is the Lamb of
interesting.
God. It's a pattern. That kind of stuff. So, so Don, so the basic answer to your question is, if you're on the futurist timeline, everything from chapter 4 forward is in the future, our future. On everybody else's timeline, except for the idealist, everything from chapter 19 forward, you know, wherever Christ returns. Actually, preterists think Christ returns somewhere in chapter 20, but
20,
yeah. But most of the time it's 19 or 20. So you just say 19 or 20 is in the future, depending on how you define the rider on the white horse and the 1,000 years. The typical idealist and preterist interpretation of the 1,000 years is it's the time, that period of time already begun. Yeah, that period of time begun in the first century and is continuing now. And this is Christ with his word conquering during this period of time. And we can talk about that, you know, now or later if anybody's got a question about that. But
Well, yeah, because it's been 2,000 years.
right, so 1,000 years is a symbol.
It's a symbol. Okay, yeah,
Right.
because okay.
So, and the interesting thing, when you compare how people, how different groups, different eschatological camps interpret the interpret passages like, say, Revelation 20. We read it today about, you know, the John saw the souls and they came to life and reigned with Christ. If we kept reading that, we would see that was the first resurrection, and then it says the rest of the dead didn't come to life until 1,000 years later, till the 1,000 years was up, then they came to life. And or yeah, something it's almost that's almost the exact language. Anyway, Revelation 20 appears to teach two resurrections separated by 1,000 years.
Okay.
And so historic premillennialism and dispensationalism, right? So dispensationalism is based on a literal hermeneutic, and so they would read that and say, this is very clear. There's two resurrections separated by 1,000 years. Historic premillennialism is not based on a literal hermeneutic, but they still come to the same conclusion. And they come to the same conclusion partially based on their idea of what's called progressive revelation. What that just means, it's really simple, is that God revealed things over time, and that at the beginning he didn't reveal everything he had to say, but he revealed more of what he had already, you know, he says something and then he reveals more about it as time goes on. And so that later revelation is more complete than former revelation. We all understand that. And so on the premillennial view, part of the argument for Revelation 20 being, the basic question is, other parts of the Bible teach that there is no time between the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked, that they're resurrected at the same time. So other parts of the Bible, in the Gospel of John, for instance, and First Corinthians and other places. So how do you resolve the conflict, right? You have Revelation 20 that looks like two resurrections separated by 1,000 years. And you have, say, John 5, 28 and 29, which explicitly says that the righteous and the wicked are resurrected in the same hour. And so how do you resolve the conflict? Well, on dispensationalism, they resolve it by saying there's lots of resurrections. And John's talking about a particular resurrection time period, and Revelation's talking about some other time period.
Chuck.
Yeah,
I don't know.
He's freezing.
Am I?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I should stop talking then.
You're going to have to go back and repeat yourself.
That's too bad. I was on a roll. I said everything.
I know, that's disappointing, darn it.
Where did I break up? Can anybody remember what I was talking about?
We were
Oh.
talking about John and John saying that it occurs at the same time. There was
Right.
no 1,000 years. Is that right, Chuck?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, that's
is
what
that
I
right?
said. Yeah, and that is right. John doesn't explicitly say there's no 1,000 years, but what he does say in John 5, 28 and 29 is that the righteous and the wicked are resurrected in the same hour.
Mm-hmm.
That would kind of preclude having 1,000 years between them.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, how do you resolve the apparent conflict, right, between Revelation 20 and its teaching about its words about two resurrections separated by 1,000 years, and the other teaching in the Bible, which I just gave you the example from John 5, but you also have 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 2 and stuff like that. Am I still breaking up?
The the audio is pretty much okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. The audio is good, so we'll go with that. So the basic way that people resolve, aside from dispensationalism, which just says this is literal, so they don't really have a method, they just take everything literal and try to make it fit. The actual way that the church has resolved apparent conflicts between passages, one of the ways they do is they would take the rule is you take the clear passage and you use it to help you understand the unclear passage. And one of the ways that you would decide what is a clear and unclear passage is you would look at what type of literature is it in. So obviously, if it's in like a law, you shall not murder, that's very clear. There's very little figurative language in laws. And as you move across the scale, laws, narrative history, teaching, didactic, teaching, speeches, things like that, letters, you have the appearance of some figurative language, but the majority of the language is just clear, straightforward language in those types of writings. But when you get to poetry, it's more than 50% figurative. And prophecy is even more. And apocalyptic literature is even higher. Certainly when you're looking at a vision, it's figurative language. And so what the church has historically said is that when you look at Revelation 20, which is in a vision, in an apocalyptic book, it uses symbols all the time. And you look at what Jesus says in John, that John is the clear passage. Right? And so we interpret Revelation according to what John said. And you remember John wrote both of these and he's not in conflict with himself. But in the Gospel of John, what Jesus says would be the thing that's considered clear. And so you use that to interpret the Revelation passage. And if you do that, you come up with the idea that it doesn't say that there are two resurrections with 1,000 years between it. And then
it doesn't suggest it.
Yeah,
That's
right. You'd have to come to that conclusion. But premillennialists, historic premillennialists, because of their doctrine of progressive revelation, they say, well, Revelation, the book of Revelation was the last thing written, therefore it's the clearest. And so since Revelation 20 was written after Jesus spoke those words in John 5, and Revelation 20 appears to say that there are two resurrections separated by 1,000 years, well, that's the clear passage, because it's the latest passage.
Oh,
So their criteria is latest passage. Other groups have the criteria of what type of literature is that, right? And so you have to decide what you think about that, and that will determine how you interpret Revelation 20. You know, those are the basic two ways that you would approach it. To say it's literal is not helpful, because it's obviously not. In Revelation 20, John sees souls. That's not literal.
no.
In Revelation 20, Satan is bound by a chain and thrown into a pit, and a lid is put over it. Satan is a spirit. This is not literal. There's all kinds of figurative language, obviously figurative language, in the
Oh,
text
yeah,
right there. Yeah,
right.
but in John 5, it's not like that at all. John 5, it's straight teaching. So it's also in 1 Corinthians, it's just straight teaching. And so you would have to decide, if I'm looking at literary genre, which one is clearer? Obviously, teaching is clearer than, or a letter is clearer than a vision. And so you would then have to interpret it that way. But anyway, so the differences of interpretation of passages, what we see is, we go, well, dispensationalists say this and they think this and they think that. But all of those things are the product of a commitment to certain principles of interpretation and particular methods of how do I resolve passages in conflict, right? And so you have to sit down and think about what is the best way to resolve these passages in conflict. Which of these ways that people use that the church has used? We're not just talking about people; we're talking about the church has used. Which of these ways, is the one that has the most support biblically, logically? Which one is the most coherent? Everybody has to decide on those types of things. I would say, as a helpful resource, you could go online and look at the Westminster Confession of Faith. Read chapter 1, just chapter 1. It'll take you 20 minutes, and it goes over what is the Bible, how do we know these books should be in the Bible, and then it says how does the Bible say the Bible should be interpreted, and it lays out some really good summaries of I think a very sound biblical method that the Bible teaches of interpreting it. So that's the other thing about dispensationalism that I didn't mention. If somebody says, like a dispensationalist, they'll say we have to interpret it literally and literally, and they're often really proud about it. We're the only people that take God at His word. God said this, and we believe it. And the question that people ask is usually wrong, but the right question that they should ask a dispensationalist is, where does the Bible teach you to interpret it literally? Where in the Bible do we see that the Bible should be interpreted literally? And you know what the answer to that is it's nowhere.
Mhm.
And then if you ask, does the Bible give us teaching and examples on how it should be interpreted? And the answer to that is, of course it does. The entire New Testament is an interpretation of the Old Testament. I just look at the way that the New Testament uses the Old Testament. You can count it, you can look, and if you actually look at it and you trace down all of the references to the Old Testament, like we've been doing in Revelation, just off the top of your head, if you think about all the references we've looked at, just your general impression. My general impression is that over 80% of the time, those are figuratively used in the New Testament.
Yes, they are.
They're
That's
not,
what's
they're,
amazing.
yeah, they're not being used literally. They're literally being used, but they're being used in a figurative way. And so does the Bible teach us how to interpret the Bible? Of course it does. The apostles interpret the Old Testament. And isn't that the right way to interpret the Bible? Yes.
Hmm.
That would be.
Yeah.
So I think that's really helpful to ask, where do you get this idea of literalism? Because it's not in the Bible. And they can point at some things and go, well, see, he was going to be born in Bethlehem, and he was born in Bethlehem. You go, yeah, and he was going to be a light to the Gentiles.
He was.
But he was figuratively. People were going to stumble over him. He was going to be a rock that people stumbled over. Did they
He's a
really?
lamb.
He's a lamb.
Yeah, lamb. Yeah.
He's the priest. He's the king, right?
Hmm.
He's the ark. It just, he's the temple. Jesus says, I'm the temple. How is he interpreting the Old Testament when he says that? He's interpreting it in a figurative way. He's saying that's a symbol.
Right.
So that's what we should be doing. So the dispensationalist insistence on literalism, I just think is goes against everything that the New Testament teaches. And so that raises the final point, which is about what's called testament priority. So testament meaning Old Testament or New Testament priority. Which one do you give priority to in your interpretation? Do we interpret the Bible starting from Genesis and going forward? And so we say the whole Bible is about Israel. The whole Bible is about God's promises to Israel. That's what we say when we read the Bible from the front to the end. And that's Old Testament priority. Or do we give the New Testament priority and let the apostles and Jesus tell us what the Old Testament is about?
Well, Chuck,
So,
Yeah.
in Zechariah, where he talks about when the Lord comes, your spoils shall be divided in the middle of you, for I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, the women ravished, and that would be Matthew, wouldn't it?
well,
And
that same thing happens over and over, but yeah, I do think it is Matthew 24
well, then he
language.
said, and then he goes on and he says, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And
Mhm.
his feet shall stand in that day on the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall split in the middle, therefore towards the east and towards the west. And there shall be a great valley. And half of the mountain shall remove towards the north and half of it towards the south. Is that his return?
Yeah, no, I'm not prepared to talk about Zechariah 14.
Okay.
There's a lot of symbolism there. The one
Okay.
that stands out to me most right now is verse 8. On that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea.
Mhm.
They'll continue in summer as in winter. All right, this is a picture drawn from Ezekiel's temple, living water flowing out of the temple. This is a picture used by Jesus later on to say, from him and from the disciple, he who receives the Spirit will have living waters flowing out of them. So
it has nothing to do with Revelation then.
Well, it might. I mean, Zechariah 14 somewhere is quoted in Revelation 1. I think it might be verse 12. No, let's see. It's not 12. Revelation uses Zechariah quite a bit, and chapter 14 is quoted in chapter 1 of Revelation. But I don't want to make any real interpretive statements on the verse 14, except to say that a lot of the language and images and descriptions of battle appear frequently in the Old Testament, and they're applied to lots of different battles in lots of different times. Fall of Edom, fall of Moab, fall of Babylon, that kind of stuff. So it could be about the second coming, but on the other hand, I don't have a firm opinion about it. I guess I'll say it like that.
Thank you for staying on and taking the time with us.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you a lot.
yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. And is it okay if I make the video available to everybody else so they can follow it?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go
Yeah.
ahead and I'll go ahead and,
Today's Thursday. Okay, so I'll see you tonight.
yes, you'll see me tonight. All right.
I
All
will.
right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
All right. I'll see you, Shirley. Bye-bye. Have a good
All
night.
righty.
Good day.
You too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So my thing is not ending. I'm trying to